On a fog-shrouded night in the autumn of 1776, somewhere in the rolling hills of Westchester County, a Hessian soldier's world ended in an instant. One moment he was charging through the darkness, his saber gleaming in the moonlight. The next, a cannonball tore through the night and changed American folklore forever. But this is not just the story of one soldier's violent death. This is the story of how ancient European terrors crossed an ocean, took root in American soil, and gave birth to one of our nation's most enduring legends. The tale you think you know, the one Washington Irving made famous in his 1820 masterpiece, is just the surface of something far older and far more terrifying. Beneath the quaint colonial setting of Sleepy Hollow lies a web of ancient mythology, real historical bloodshed, and primal human fears that stretch back over 1,000 years. Tonight, we journey into the shadows to uncover the true origins of the Headless Horseman, and what we discover will forever change how you see this iconic figure of American horror. You see, the Headless Horseman was never just an American ghost story. He was a traveler, an ancient fear that had been stalking humanity across continents for centuries before he ever set foot on colonial soil. His roots run deep into the dark forests of medieval Europe, where headless riders were not quaint Halloween tales, but genuine terrors that kept entire villages cowering behind locked doors when the moon was new and the mists rose from the marshlands. To understand the true story of America's most famous spectre, we must first journey across the Atlantic, back to the windswept hills of Ireland, where the legend began with a figure so terrifying that its very name was whispered in dread. They called him the Dullahan, and he was death incarnate. The Dullahan was no mere ghost. He was a harbinger, a supernatural executioner whose appearance meant that someone's time on earth was about to end. Picture, if you can, a rider dressed in the tattered black robes of mourning, mounted upon a coal-black steed, whose nostrils shot forth sparks and flame as it galloped through the night. But the most horrifying detail was what the rider carried beneath his arm, his own severed head, its skin stretched tight like parchment over a drum, its eyes rolling wildly in their sockets like burning meteors, scanning the darkness with supernatural sight. This grotesque figure was said to possess vision that could pierce through any darkness, any distance. When the Dullahan rode, he held his head high, using those fiery eyes to scout the countryside for his intended victim. And when he found his target, he would call out their name in a voice like the howling wind, and at that moment, the person would drop dead where they stood. There was no escape, no bargaining, no mercy. The Dullahan represented fate itself, cold and inexorable. But the Dullahan's origins reach even deeper into the mists of prehistory. Long before Christianity came to the emerald shores of Ireland, the Celtic peoples worshipped a fertility god known as Crom Dubh, whose name meant simply the Dark One. This ancient deity demanded the ultimate sacrifice from his followers. Human lives offered up through ritual decapitation, their blood spilled to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the tribe. The worship of Crom Dubh was no gentle affair. It was a religion of blood and terror, where the severing of heads was believed to release the soul and send it directly to the god's otherworldly realm. King Tigamas, ruler of ancient Ireland, was said to be among Crom Dubh's most devoted followers, organizing mass sacrificial rituals where dozens of victims would lose their heads to appease the dark god's hunger. When Christian missionaries arrived in Ireland in the 6th century, they brought with them a new faith that condemned these ancient practices as demonic. The old gods were declared false, their rituals branded as evil, and slowly but surely the sacrificial altars of Crom Dubh fell silent. But the Irish believed that the dark god did not simply vanish into history. Instead, he transformed, taking on a new and even more terrifying form. The Dullahan, they whispered, was Crom Dubh's revenge upon the world. Denied his rightful sacrifices, the ancient god had become a supernatural hunter, roaming the countryside to claim the heads that were no longer willingly offered to him. This was not just folklore, but a way for the Irish people to make sense of the violent transformation of their spiritual world. The Headless Horseman became a bridge between the old faith and the new, a reminder that some hungers are too ancient and too powerful to be easily satisfied. The terror of the Dullahan spread beyond Ireland, taking root in the folklore of neighbouring lands. In the misty highlands of Scotland, similar figures emerged, ghostly riders who heralded death and disaster. Across the sea in Germany, the brothers Grimm collected tales of headless horsemen who rode through the Black Forest, their presence announced by the haunting sound of a hunting horn echoing through the trees. But the German version carried a different flavour of dread. Rather than actively hunting victims, these Teutonic horsemen served as harbingers of fate, appearing to warn hunters and travellers of impending doom. The sound of that spectral horn was said to be a final mercy, a supernatural warning that death was near. Those wise enough to heed the warning might yet escape their fate, but those who ignored it would find themselves face to face with the ultimate predator before the night was through. These Germanic tales carried their own unique horror. The headless horsemen of German folklore were said to kill, not with blade or claw, but with a single touch. Their very presence was so antithetical to life that contact with them meant instant death. This made them even more terrifying in some ways than their Irish cousins, for they represented death as a force of nature itself, inescapable and absolute. What made all these European traditions so enduring was their ability to tap into humanity's deepest fears. The loss of one's head represented far more than mere death. In cultures across the world, the head was considered the seat of the soul, the center of identity and consciousness. To be beheaded was to be denied not just life, but the very essence of what made one human. A headless spirit was therefore the ultimate abomination, a creature trapped between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. These ancient fears found fertile ground in the superstitious minds of medieval Europe, where death was a constant companion and the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds seemed dangerously thin. Long winter nights were filled with tales of supernatural riders whose hoofbeats could be heard echoing across frozen fields, harbingers of plague, war, and famine. As centuries passed and the age of exploration dawned, these old fears travelled with European colonists to the New World. Dutch settlers brought their own versions of the Headless Horseman legend to the Hudson River Valley, where they mingled with German folklore brought by other immigrant communities. The ancient terror was adapting, evolving, preparing to take on a distinctly American form. But it would take a very specific historical moment, a brutal collision between Old World armies on New World soil, to provide the perfect catalyst for America's greatest ghost story. That moment came in the autumn of 1776, when Hessian mercenaries in service to the British Crown found themselves facing American patriots in a series of bloody engagements that would leave the countryside littered with the dead and provide the raw material for a legend that would outlive them all. The stage was set. The ancient European terror had crossed the ocean, and now it needed only the right circumstances to be reborn in American soil. The Revolutionary War was not the genteel affair often portrayed in sanitized history books. It was a savage, brutal conflict where men died in the most horrific ways imaginable. And nowhere was this brutality more evident than in the campaign of 1776, when British forces, bolstered by thousands of German mercenaries, swept through New York in a series of devastating victories that nearly crushed the American rebellion before it could truly begin. These German soldiers, known as Hessians after the region from which many of them came, were not fighting for ideology or patriotism. They were professional warriors, sold by their princes to the British Crown like cattle at market. Dressed in their distinctive blue uniforms and tall brass-fronted caps, they brought with them a reputation for ruthless efficiency and an almost mechanical approach to warfare that terrified both American soldiers and civilians alike. The Hessians were products of a military culture that valued discipline above all else. They had been drilled from childhood in the arts of war, trained to march in perfect formation, to load and fire their muskets with clockwork precision, and to charge with bayonets fixed when ordered, regardless of the odds. They were, in many ways, the perfect soldiers. But this perfection came at a cost. They were also strangers in a strange land, fighting a war they barely understood for a cause that meant nothing to them. On October 28, 1776, these foreign warriors found themselves facing American forces at the Battle of White Plains, an engagement that would prove to be another in a string of British victories. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Westchester County as approximately 13,000 British and Hessian troops prepared to assault the American positions. General William Howe, the British commander, had positioned his forces with typical military precision, but it was the Hessians under General von Heister who would bear the brunt of the fighting. The battle itself was a masterpiece of 18th century warfare, with regiment after regiment advancing in perfect lines across open ground, while cannon roared and muskets cracked like thunder. The Americans, command their ground well, positioned by George Washington himself, had chosen themselves on Chatterton Hill with clear fields of fire. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and when the Hessian assault began in earnest, the outcome was never truly in doubt. What followed was not the clean, bloodless conflict of Hollywood imagination, but a savage melee where men died screaming in agony, their bodies torn apart by grape shot and canister rounds. The weapons of the Revolutionary War era were designed not just to kill, but to maim and terrorize. A direct hit from a cannonball could decapitate a man as cleanly as an executioner's axe, while a near miss could tear off limbs or shatter bones into fragments. It was in this hellish chaos that our story truly begins. Among the Hessian forces advancing up that blood-soaked hill was an artillery unit, their brass cannon gleaming in the autumn sunlight as they wheeled it into position to support the infantry assault. These men were specialists, trained in the deadly mathematics of artillery warfare, calculating angles and charges with the precision of mathematicians. But all their training could not protect them from the random horror of battle. American artillery positions on the heights above had been waiting for just such a target. When the Hessian gun crew came into range, the order was given, and American cannon roared in response. The mathematics of death are brutally simple. A 12-pound iron ball, fired from a cannon at close range, travels at approximately 1,500 feet per second. When it strikes a human body, the results are instantaneous and absolute. Major General William Heath, commanding American forces in the sector, would later write in his journal about what he witnessed that day. His clinical description, published years later, recorded how a single shot from an American cannon took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. The language is matter of fact, almost casual, but the reality it describes is anything but. In an instant, a professional soldier, a man with a name and a history, and perhaps a family waiting for him back in Germany, was reduced to nothing more than a headless corpse sprawled in the mud of a foreign battlefield. But this unnamed Hessian was not alone in his fate. The Battle of White Plains was followed by a series of smaller engagements throughout the region, each adding to the growing toll of dead and wounded. A few days later, on November 1st, Heath recorded another eerily similar incident, another Hessian soldier decapitated by American artillery fire. The repetition is significant, suggesting that such horrific wounds were not rare aberrations, but common occurrences in the brutal reality of 18th century warfare. These were not the only headless corpses left behind in Westchester County during that bloody autumn. The entire New York campaign of 1776 was a catalogue of horror, of soldiers with hundreds from both sides meeting violent ends in the forests and fields that would one day become the setting for Washington Irving's immortal tale. Each death added another layer to the growing mythology of the region, another ghost to the collection of restless spirits that local residents whispered about in the years that followed. The psychological impact of such carnage on the civilian population cannot be overstated. These were farming communities, places where everyone knew everyone else, where violent death was rare and shocking. Suddenly, their familiar landscape had been transformed into a charnel house, their peaceful fields littered with the broken bodies of foreign soldiers. The very ground seemed cursed, soaked with blood, and haunted by the screams of the dying. In the immediate aftermath of the battles, the practical business of war continued. The dead were buried, often hastily and without ceremony. Mass graves were dug for the common soldiers, while officers might receive individual burials if time and circumstances permitted. But for many of the fallen, particularly the foreign mercenaries who had no families nearby to claim their bodies, burial was a perfunctory affair at best. The headless Hessian, whoever he might have been, was almost certainly interred in one of these anonymous graves, his identity lost forever to history. Perhaps his body was buried intact, the severed head placed beside it in a grotesque parody of peaceful rest. Or perhaps, in the chaos and horror of the battlefield cleanup, the head was never found, leaving behind a corpse that would forever remain incomplete. Local residents, tasked with the grim duty of burying the dead, would have been deeply affected by what they witnessed. In an age when proper burial rites were considered essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife, the sight of headless corpses would have been particularly disturbing. According to the religious beliefs of the time, a body that was not whole could not rest properly, creating the perfect conditions for the birth of a supernatural legend. The stories began almost immediately. Farmers working fields near the old battlegrounds reported strange sounds in the night, the thunder of hoofbeats where no horse should be. Travelers on lonely roads claimed to have seen shadowy figures on horseback, riders who vanished when approached too closely. The boundary between memory and myth began to blur as the traumatic events of the war were processed through the lens of folk belief and supernatural tradition. As the months turned to years and the Revolutionary War ground on toward its eventual conclusion, these whispered tales began to take on a life of their own. The trauma of battle had planted seeds in the collective memory of the Hudson River Valley, and those seeds were beginning to sprout into something far more sinister than mere historical record. The local Dutch and German communities, already steeped in their own Headless Horseman traditions brought from the old country, found these new American ghost stories disturbingly familiar. The ancient European fears they had carried across the ocean suddenly had a local face, a specific identity rooted in the blood-soaked soil of their new homeland. The nameless Hessian soldier, his head torn away by American cannon fire, became the perfect vessel for these ancestral terrors. But what transformed scattered battlefield rumors into enduring legend was the unique cultural landscape of the Hudson River Valley itself. This was a region caught between worlds, where Dutch colonial traditions mingled with English law, where German Lutheran churches stood alongside Presbyterian meeting houses, and where the old superstitions of Europe found new expression in American soil. The geography itself seemed designed for supernatural encounters. The valley was a place of rolling hills and deep hollows, of ancient forests that had never felt the bite of an axe, and winding roads that disappeared into morning mists. Sleepy Hollow, as the locals had come to call one particular glen, was especially atmospheric. Sheltered by high hills on either side, it was a place where fog lingered long after sunrise and shadows fell early in the afternoon. The old Dutch church stood at the heart of this landscape like a sentinel from another age. Built in 1685 of local stone, its thick walls and small windows gave it an almost fortress-like appearance. The churchyard that surrounded it was filled with weathered headstones bearing Dutch names that few could pronounce, their carved inscriptions telling the stories of families who had lived and died in this valley for generations. It was here, according to growing local legend, that the headless Hessian had been buried. The exact location of his grave became a matter of intense speculation among the locals. Some claimed he lay beneath an unmarked stone in the far corner of the churchyard, while others insisted his body had been interred in unconsecrated ground beyond the church walls. The uncertainty only added to the mystique, creating a sense that the restless spirit could emerge from anywhere. The timing of these supernatural encounters followed a predictable pattern. Sightings were most common during the autumn months, particularly around the anniversary of the Battle of White Plains. Local residents noted that the phantom rider seemed especially active during the dark of the moon, when shadows were deepest and the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. Witnesses described remarkably consistent encounters. The sound always came first, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats echoing through the valley at a pace no living horse could maintain. Then came the sight itself, a dark figure on horseback, racing along the old roads with supernatural speed. But it was the absence that truly terrified those who claimed to have seen him. Where the rider's head should have been, there was only empty space, a void that seemed to swallow light itself. The phantom's behavior followed patterns that locals came to recognize and fear. He was most often seen near the old battlefields, as if drawn by some invisible force to the sites of his earthly demise. Travelers reported encounters on the road between White Plains and Sleepy Hollow, particularly near the bridge that crossed the Pocantico River. This wooden structure, known locally as the Headless Horseman Bridge, became a focal point for supernatural activity. According to the emerging folklore, the headless rider not cross was bound by certain supernatural rules. He could running water, which explained why so many encounters ended at the bridge. He was said to be most active between midnight and dawn, the traditional hours when the veil between worlds was thinnest. And he seemed particularly drawn to certain types of people, scholars and schoolmasters, as if some aspect of his earthly existence had created an eternal resentment toward learning and education. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Farmers claimed the phantom rider had chased them across moonlit fields, his horse's hooves striking sparks from stone walls. Mill workers reported seeing him water his supernatural steed at the mill pond, the headless figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Children walking to school swore they had heard his approach and hidden in roadside ditches until the terrible sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. These encounters were not merely entertainment. In a community where most people could neither read nor write, oral tradition served as both historical record and moral instruction. The story of the Headless Hessian became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the violence that had torn through their peaceful valley and a warning about the consequences of war. But the legend served another, deeper purpose. It provided a way for the local community to process the trauma they had witnessed, to transform the random horror of battlefield death into something with meaning and structure. The Headless Hessian was not just a ghost, he was a symbol of unfinished business, of justice delayed but not denied. The phantom's apparent inability to rest was interpreted through the lens of contemporary religious belief. In an age when proper burial and last rites were considered essential for the soul's journey to heaven, a soldier who had died violently and been buried hastily was exactly the sort of spirit who might be doomed to wander the earth. The missing head only hounded this spiritual comp crisis, creating a soul that was literally incomplete. As the years passed, and the immediate memory of the Revolutionary War began to fade, the story of the Headless Hessian evolved from recent history into established folklore. New details were added with each generation, each storyteller contributing their own embellishments to the growing legend. The phantom acquired supernatural powers, the ability to appear and disappear at will, to ride through solid objects, and to pursue his victims with relentless determination. By the time Washington Irving encountered these stories during his teenage years in the Tarrytown area, they had already become an integral part of local culture. Irving, fleeing a yellow fever epidemic in Manhattan, found himself immersed in a world where the supernatural was not abstract, but immediate, where neighbors spoke matter-of-factly about encounters with the headless rider, as if discussing the weather. The young Irving was captivated by these tales, but more importantly, he recognized their literary potential. Here was a uniquely American ghost story, one that combined the ancient fears of European folklore with the specific historical trauma of the Revolutionary War. It was a story that could compete with the Gothic traditions of the Old World while remaining distinctly rooted in American soil. What Irving understood, perhaps better than anyone before him, was that the most powerful ghost stories are not about the supernatural at all. They are about the human capacity for fear, guilt, and the desperate need to make sense of senseless tragedy. The Headless Hessian was terrifying not because he was a ghost, but because he represented all the unresolved conflicts and lingering resentments of America's violent birth as a nation. The Phantom Rider embodied the complex relationship between Americans and their own history. He was simultaneously the enemy soldier they had killed in battle and the victim of their violence, the foreign invader and the tragic figure deserving of sympathy. His headless state made him impossible to humanize, yet his persistence made him impossible to forget. Irving's genius would lie in his ability to take this raw folkloric material and transform it into something greater, a story that captured not just the local fears of one Hudson River Valley community, but the broader anxieties of a young nation still struggling to define itself. The Headless Hessian would become the perfect metaphor for America's complicated relationship with its own past, a past that refused to stay buried no matter how much time passed. But that transformation was still years in the future. For now, the legend remained what it had always been, a local story told around fireplaces on winter nights, a cautionary tale that kept children close to home after dark, and a reminder that some wounds, whether inflicted on individuals or entire communities, never truly heal. The seeds of America's greatest ghost story had been planted in blood and watered with tears. Soon, they would bloom into something immortal. The transformation of local folklore into literary masterpiece required not just talent, but timing. By the early 1800s, America was experiencing a cultural awakening, a desperate hunger for stories that could match the rich literary traditions of Europe while remaining distinctly American. The young nation had won its political independence, but cultural independence remained elusive. American writers still looked to London and Paris for validation, still measured their workances and supernatural tales that dominate against the Gothic-rommed European literature. Into this cultural moment stepped Washington Irving, a man perfectly positioned to bridge occasion and New World authenticity. Born in 17, the gap between Old World sophist 83, the same year the Revolutionary War officially ended, Irving belonged to the first generation of Americans who had no direct memory of colonial rule. He was, in every sense, a product of the new republic, yet he was also deeply influenced by European culture and literature. Irving's early life reads like a preparation for literary greatness. As a young man, he had traveled extensively throughout Europe, absorbing the Gothic atmospheres of German castles and the romantic landscapes of English countryside. He had read widely in European folklore, studying the works of the Brothers Grimm and other collectors of supernatural tales. But most importantly, he had spent his formative years in the Hudson River Valley, where he had been immersed in the local ghost stories that would eventually make him famous. The convergence of these influences created a unique literary sensibility. Irving understood that the most effective supernatural tales were not pure fantasy, but stories rooted in recognizable reality. The best ghost stories, he realized, were those that took familiar places and familiar people, and introduced just enough of the supernatural to make readers question what was real and what was imagination. When Irving began crafting what would become the legend of Sleepy Hollow, he was not simply recording local folklore. He was performing a kind of literary alchemy, transforming raw oral tradition into sophisticated written narrative. Every element of the story was carefully chosen to maximize its impact on readers who had never set foot in Westchester County, but who shared the universal human capacity for fear and wonder. The genius of Irving's approach lay in his decision to ground the supernatural elements in meticulously observed reality. He populated his story with real family names from the region: Van Tassel and Van Ripper and Crane, names that local readers would recognize immediately. He described real locations in loving detail: the old Dutch church and its ancient graveyard, the winding roads that connected the scattered farms of the valley, the very bridge where so many claimed to have encountered the phantom rider. But Irving's masterstroke was his creation of Ichabod Crane, the gangly schoolmaster who would serve as both protagonist and comic foil for the Headless Horseman. Crane was not simply a character, he was a representation of a particular type of American, the intellectual who was simultaneously attracted to and terrified by the supernatural world around him. In Crane, Irving created the perfect vehicle for exploring the tension between reason and superstition that defined early American culture. The character of Ichabod embodied the contradictions of his age. He was educated but credulous, rational but superstitious, modern but haunted by ancient fears. He represented the new American intellectual class, men who had access to books and learning, but who still lived in a world where the supernatural seemed not just possible, but probable. Through Crane, Irving could explore the ways in which even the most educated minds could be overwhelmed by primal terror. The relationship between Ichabod and the Headless Horseman was far more complex than a simple tale of ghost meets mortal. It was a confrontation between two different ways of understanding the world. The Phantom Rider represented the violent, chaotic past that America was trying to leave behind, while Ichabod embodied the rational, ordered future that the nation was trying to build. Their encounter was not just supernatural, it was symbolic, a collision between past and future that could only end with one destroying the other. Irving's decision to set his story during the autumn season was equally calculated. Autumn in the Hudson River Valley was a time of spectacular beauty, when the forests blazed with color and the air itself seemed to shimmer with golden light. But it was also a time of death, when the natural world began its annual surrender to winter's grip. This seasonal setting created the perfect atmosphere for a tale that dealt with themes of mortality and the persistence of the past. The timing also connected the story to harvest festivals and All Hallows' Eve, ancient celebrations that acknowledged the thinning of the veil between worlds. Irving understood that certain times of year made supernatural encounters seem not just possible, but inevitable. By setting his tale in autumn, he tapped into seasonal rhythms that went back to humanity's prehistoric past. The publication of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820 marked a watershed moment in American literature. For the first time, an American writer had created a supernatural tale that could stand comparison with the best Gothic fiction Europe had to offer. The story was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, praised by critics both in America and abroad for its atmospheric description, psychological insight, and masterful blend of humor and horror. But the story's success went far beyond literary merit. Irving had succeeded in creating something that American culture desperately needed: a homegrown mythology that could compete with the ancient legends of Europe. The Headless Horseman became America's first truly iconic supernatural figure, a character that embodied both the nation's violent origins and its ongoing struggle to define itself. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey through the mists of time and legend. The Headless Horseman you thought you knew was never just one story, but a tapestry woven from ancient Celtic blood sacrifices, Germanic forest spirits, Revolutionary War battlefields, and the brilliant imagination of Washington Irving. From the Dullahan's fiery eyes scanning the Irish countryside to that unnamed Hessian soldier whose head was torn away by American cannon fire, we have traced the Phantom's path across continents and centuries. The true terror of the Headless Horseman lies not in his supernatural powers, but in what he represents: our collective inability to escape the violent ghosts of our past. Every time you hear hoofbeats in the darkness or catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of sight, remember that some legends are more than stories. They are the echoes of ancient fears that refuse to die, reminders that history, like the Headless Rider himself, never truly rests in peace.